Right. Good afternoon, good evening, and thank you all for your patience. My name is Taylor Porter. I am one of the co-founders of Ohio Gap Closers, and tonight we're going to come to you with part two of helping our community by trying to attack the racial issues and the race gap that we all know is prevalent. OhioGapClosers.com is where you can find free resources, and we appreciate any donations to support our efforts to close all gaps, especially here in Ohio. I guess I should mention that our core focus is on improving the academic outcomes of students in foster care. And so that is the number one gap that we want to start with. But with the recent issues and frustrations, and quite frankly, the tragedies that we've all seen when it comes to police relations, I think it would be a disservice if Ohio Gap Closers didn't step up and talk about what's going on in our community. It's affecting me as an adult, it's affecting my family here at home, and I think we all would agree that it's affecting our kids as well. And so with that being said, if you guys would like to kind of hop in, and we'll pick it up after you guys do an introduction.
Good evening. My name is Mark Bobo, and I'm privileged to serve as one of the co-founders of the Ohio Gap Closers. I've been a child advocate for the majority of my career, always believing in the possibilities of the minds and hearts of our youth. And this is an awesome way that I'm able to invest in what I believe is our greatest natural resource. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Emily Ragland, also a co-founder of Ohio Gap Closers. So glad to be a part of the conversation. I've been working with higher ed specifically for about the last 10 years or so, an advocate specifically for college access and closing that higher education gap.
Good evening. My name is Raquel Armstrong, and I'm also privileged to be a co-founder of Ohio Gap Closers. I've been working in K-12 education for the last 10 years, specifically in leadership for the last 5. And the mission has really drawn me, particularly in seeing how children who are in foster care are often kids that we think of are in very unique situations, when in reality it represents a big subset of a variety of youth that we serve. And so I'm privileged to be here.
My name is Travis Porter. I'm also one of the co-founders. I've been in social work for 20 plus years. I'm a big advocate of giving back and pouring into the community, and this is one of the ways I like to do that. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Charmaine Campbell, and I've been in education for over 18 years, the last 5 years serving as an elementary school principal, and I serve on the board of Ohio Gap Closers.
My name is Jennifer Stovall. Just finished up my 23rd year in education. Currently serve as a school counselor at the high school level. Also privileged to be a member of the advisory board for the Ohio Gap Closers.
My name is Gia Bell. I work in training development. I work in the leadership area of training and development. I am a advisory board member of Ohio Gap Closers, and I have had some personal experiences with children affected by being in the foster care system.
Hi, I'm Tracy McCarty, and I'm a licensed independent social worker and have been for about 20 years working in mental health and foster care services. And now I serve on the advisory board for Ohio Gap Closers.
Okay, so let's get into it. I think the audience probably has a good feel for who we are as individuals, and I think together it's important just to say that Ohio Gap Closers was really started on the bedrock of family, and started with Ella Louise Porter and my father, Ray Porter, right? This is something that was very near and dear to my parents' heart, is taking care of kids in our community that were struggling and didn't have the adult support that we know they need. And You know, speaking of my dad, yesterday was Father's Day, and Travis and I and Emily, we were at my dad's place for Father's Day, and we started talking about something that I think directly relates to what we're going to get into tonight, which is what are you going to do about race relations and closing that racial gap in our community? And so we were all sitting down yesterday eating chicken and JoJo's and having a good time. And my dad started telling a story about his transition from Alabama to Ohio. And that's something like within the African American community is the Great Migration. There was a time period where that was really, really popular. A lot of people left the South to find opportunities in the industrial North. And my dad was one of those people. And so anyway, his story wasn't about industrial revolution. His story was about family and how his first house was literally next door to his mom, my grandmother. And then on the left side of his house was another family member, an uncle. And then the backyard literally pressed up against the backyard of another family member. And so we know that our focus on a day-to-day is directly working with children and improving their lives. But after hearing my dad tell the story about the village that he lived with and how much love and just safety and support was right in our own neighborhood, and Travis, you can probably weigh in on this story as well. It was really, really like nostalgic. And it was like, oh, that was so cool. And then my sister brought up something called redlining. And immediately we got focused on, wait a minute. We've heard of redlining. We know it was another system of oppression. We know it was systemic racism. Redlining is something that was really, really popular at a certain point in time and probably still goes on in some communities today. But my dad, living next door to all of his family, really spoke to the fact that the banks and the industry of real estate didn't open doors to African Americans. And unfortunately, African Americans are still being door slammed in their face, door slammed in my face, and people that look like me. And so with that being said, I'll pass it over to you, Travis. I know you were there for that story. And I don't know if you want to weigh in before we dive into more solutions about this issue.
No, the story was very, it took me back to what was going on in that community, and it made me think of, as it relates to tonight, racism in that community and racism in the communities we're in now. You know, when I hear that story, when I thought about that story and how we have so many family members in the same vicinity, and then we look at questions of like, you know, does racism exist in our current communities? It's just really light years different. You know, back in that time period of growing up in that block or that race of family, you know, I didn't experience a lot of issues with race because it was a lot of family and friends. But as I grew older and moved out into different communities, you know, that all changed. So that story of redlining and being in that same community, that definitely was the case in the area I grew up in. African American communities was all, well, not all, I would say majority was what they call over the tracks, across the tracks. We stayed in that area, and we didn't get to venture out towards the university in our town. We were down across the tracks, and our churches were there, our houses were there, and that's kind of where we kind of, you know, stayed in our area at. But yeah, that's.
Travis, I want to ask you, because we got a couple questions teed up from the audience, and we have some things that we know we have to attack. And so I want to just hit home right off the bat. Have you ever been in a situation to where, whether it was a family member or maybe a close friend, where you felt like because of racism, you had to make a decision to either separate, to cut them off? Have you ever been in one of those situations?
You know, the saying goes, you're a direct reflection of your 4 or 5 closest friends. So if I was to answer the question of have I had to cut anybody off? No. But have I had difficult conversations and pushed to the point of having to, you know, cut some people off and disassociate myself with people? Yes. And that goes for a close family. Me being part of a biracial family, my wife is Caucasian, you know, I'm African American. I've had some issues with family on my side of the family and my wife's side of the family. But because they are family, I was able to have the conversation eventually, able to open up their minds, and I was able to see their point of view, but I was able to open up their minds to come around to some things that just wasn't right, and they wasn't treating me fairly for various reasons. But because they're family, I think I've been able to push that envelope and get to the point of I drew a line in the sand and said, if you're not able to come around and see things that's happening that's racist, then I was gonna have to cut you off. But because of the love of family members, they eventually, opened up and we were able to get on the same accord.
So it's an interesting question, and I actually, prior to you jumping in that question, was going to jump in on the redlining conversation because I was recently looking at and thinking about our mission. There's a young lady who has an organization called #FosterCare, and I follow her very closely because she's kind of a big image in the foster care industry. And she talked about the fact that we don't always question why people end up in foster care. And in her case, it was a situation where her grandmother who was raising her lost her home. And she didn't have the ability to access certain resources in order to preserve her home. So thus, she ended up in foster care. And that really resonated with me in thinking about housing discrimination and how it relates even to this question, because as I'm engaging with people, particularly in this time period, I'm finding myself in a place that I've never been. Like, I've never been the person who felt like I needed to cut anyone off. But as many people have some very pronounced opinions and beliefs that seem very kind of stuck in the sand, I feel like as a person of principle, if principally I feel like your beliefs or thoughts are immoral, that it's incumbent upon me to take a stand against that. I can't say you're my friend or even family if you're going to go against things that I think are morally imperative for us to believe in.
I'll kind of piggyback on that a little bit, Raquel. Just with you saying it's okay to start dividing, separating yourself from those toxic people. I grew up small white town, 99% white. We had one black guy in our high school. Again, being white, I didn't feel what he felt. I know he went through a lot. I witnessed it, but didn't know what he went through. Fast forward to today, I'm friends with a lot, not friends, acquaintances with people that I grew up with, and true colors are really shine through now. And it's disheartening because you want to believe people that you've always been in contact with are good-hearted, good nature, but true colors are coming through. I've had to cut off a lot of people. I feel you're not contributing to anything that I believe. You don't contribute to my views. Anyway, so I've had to cut off some people, and I think it's very important that I'm even, my family, and I don't know if many of you know, my husband is black, we have 2 sons. It's personal. Again, I'm not having their racism against me, but I'm secondhand seeing what's going on, and it's been eye-opening, I guess I can say that. So
thank you so much for sharing that, Jennifer.
mm-hmm.
It's really interesting, I think, in this age of social media. I was having a conversation with a friend because I'm of the mindset, if someone on my social media timeline, I see them as I scroll and they are saying something that I am totally against, that is completely not right for us as people, I don't unfriend them. My philosophy is that maybe I'm going to post something or maybe I can respond to try to educate them, but that also becomes tiring. It becomes tiring, especially in recent weeks. Lots of my friends and coworkers, they are adamantly scrolling through trying to comment on every single person who posts something that is racist, who posts something that is sexist, anything like that. And it really becomes so exhausting. And I think to this question of distancing from friends and family, at some point it does become exhausting to continue to try to be the one to educate, to continue to try to be the one who wants the best for them, and it's hard. I think even for me coming from a faith background, like I just think of Christ and my own self, and I think of people who do wrong, you know, as someone who has done wrong before, and the mercy and the forgiveness that comes. But at what point will those people decide, I am in need of that? I'm in need of that mercy and forgiveness. So that's really where I'm at. I'm kind of torn with it. I just think that social media makes it easy in a way to combat it, but also difficult.
Let me add, I don't initially unfriend them. It's one of those, like what you said, where you try to engage, you try to have the conversation, but after it gets too draining and there's no movement, then you kind of got to step away. Sorry.
And I certainly echo Emmy's sentiments, because I always caution the cutoff, because oftentimes we may be the only ones that can break through to that person, may have an influence. And I totally echo the effort that it takes to stay in the education mode, because you're always having to inform or enlighten, and that can become taxing and tiring. And I too, these last 30 days, it's been taxing. But I'm also cautious that, but if I don't make the effort, maybe this is the one time that they'll hear what I'm saying. And then too, I even go back to even using that term friend. I think social media has made everybody under that friend lens, because you have so many friends on social media or followers and things of that nature, where I have a very close unit of people that I consider friends, many acquaintances that you hope to have some influence on. But when you're talking about friends, it's very true what Travis says. You are a reflection of those that you keep around you, and you have to, I think, be cautiously optimistic that you can still have the impact. And then, when Travis said you have to draw a line in the sand, people need to know what you stand for, but also give them opportunity to change.
If I could add to that, I feel like I try to leave the space open for people to have those conversations with me. I think unless you have those conversations, you can never have understanding. So sometimes I think a lot of racism is a lack of understanding and a lack of education. So I always leave that space open, have those conversations, as long as it's respectful. I feel like sometimes there are tough questions that make me uncomfortable, but I feel like there's some things that I can, make them more aware of, or be open with them about, that helps them learn about who I am, or vice versa, someone else, having those conversations and creating that space where it's acceptable and, you're comfortable, speaking about race with other people or other races. I think that's the only thing that allow true change to happen. If we all are afraid to speak our minds, or to ask questions, or try to understand each other, I think we'll never, get to that point.
Sometimes I assess where people are at in their journey, my white friends and family. There's always an assessment of where they are in the process, because I think that for many, it's hard for them to wrap their mind around racial injustice. And sometimes there's a defensive posture that occurs, which is usually rooted in but I'm a good person. How can I be connected with white supremacy or racist views? Or hey, I didn't do it. Why are you coming at me? And so the ability to go through that journey of recognizing that it's not enough I'm not racist now, to be anti-racist and to really be a voice. That's a journey that I get to watch a lot of people go through. And I feel like I'm always in that mode of assessing where people are at and what their readiness is. I believe empathy is a skill that's developed, being able to see things from an alternative perspective. But if you don't practice the skill, empathy doesn't continue to develop. And I feel like immersion and education is key. And so I stay connected, and I always try to figure out what is the best approach with each person in my world to shine light. I guess that would be a good way to put it.
Yeah. Dang, you guys are on top of it. And I think, I'm going to put myself in the shoes of maybe where I used to be a number of years ago. or even right now, is when you have these situations with close friends, acquaintances, or family, how do you even know if they're racist? I'm just gonna speak from my experience. If they refer to anybody Black as a thug, you need to question that person, okay? And I don't have all the answers, but I just wanna give you some starting places. If you're around someone that refers to anyone that's African American as a thug, that's coded language. That is sign number one, they may be racist. Question them. Number two, if you are a person and you're hanging out with a Black friend or a Black family, and you go into an environment to where there's other diversity or Blacks or whatever there's gonna be, and you want them to speak first, or you want them to order the burger, or if you want your Black friends to be the first one to go in, you gotta question that environment. And so, again, I think there's a lot of ways to handle it, but I think it's good to be able to have a couple starting places to identify it. And there's a lot more, but we also have tons of things to cover tonight. But I can't get away from some of that coded language that we cover in some of our workshops. There's code words out here. And I think our audience needs to know thug is a code word and it's not acceptable. So just be mindful of that. I want to kind of flip it because we've got a few educators on the phone here. I want to put the question on the floor. We've got to come with some solutions tonight. And with your educational hat on, with your teacher hat, your principal hats, or whatever hat you want to wear, what would you say from an education standpoint is the best way to close the gap of racism?
Well, to me, and I was going to jump in based on some of what you're saying, I think it first starts with interrogating racism. I think that particularly like what Tracy was saying, there's a lot of internalization about racism or being called a racist as being about someone's individual acts, right? And I think that's a wrong definition of racism, right? It's not about individual acts. That's a very small piece of it, right? Racism is about a system, a web of beliefs and practices that have guided, at least in the United States, right, of which everyone is a participatory person within that system. Now, where you land is based upon your privilege, and in this case, related to race, based on your race, right? And then we act using power, right? So whoever has that power is able to enact as a racist, right? And when we move away from it being about an individual person and what you're actually doing intentionally and understanding that most of it is unintentional, then we can begin to interrogate that, particularly even within a school system. I appreciate, my new superintendent in this district that I'm serving as a leader. She started with saying, like, what systemically racist practices do we have in our district? And people paused and they're like, they had to think about it because they're not intentionally trying to do anything. But when they started looking at how they do busing, right? The fact that in the state, you don't have to require busing, yet certain intersections or certain places might be harder for certain kids to cross, like that translates to some systemically racist practices. But we don't think of it in that way. Who's in AP classes? A lot of different things that are happening within the school system and how it operates that we consider fair, that is not equitable and therefore systemically racist.
I like to add on to that. And so when you think about the systemic racism within the districts, you think about gifted children versus students on IEPs. African American young males are prevalent in being placed on IEPs as opposed to taking the assessment to be placed in gifted classrooms. You have those biases there that because I may be hyperactive or I can't sit for a longer period of time than my white counterparts, then now I have a learning disability because I'm not used to your traditional norms in the classroom. But I think as educators, as leaders of a school and of a district, we have to educate our staff members and have them bring about their implicit and overt biases. I think everyone comes to the table with some type of internal bias based off of how they were raised. And it's funny, I had a conversation with one of my staff members. He came into the school building today and he said, you know what, my parents are racist. And he said, that's how I grew up, but I'm trying my best not to continue to be that way. And he opened up to me, and I think he felt like he had a breath of fresh air, that he was able to get that off of his chest. You know, that this is the home that I grew up in, but I want you to know this is not the way that I think or the way that I believe. And I think in order for us to have these conversations, it starts with what you all are doing now. It's getting it out on the forefront and letting people to know there is an issue, but in order for us to have these genuine conversations, it starts with relationship. It starts with relationships, so I can show you that I'm no different from you. If I go to Disney World, and I had this incident when I went to Disney with my daughter, I had an older white lady on the train, and she said, "Oh, how long have you all been here?" And I told her, she said, "Well, how did you get here?" It was almost asking me, how did you afford to come here for that period of time? And it's because of her implicit bias. And so after that incident, I had to have a conversation with my daughter, and then it made me think and reflect, you know, wow, there are still individuals in this world that believe that we are still in the 60s and 70s, that they don't know there are educated Black Americans, there are middle class and upper class Black Americans here in our country. And to still question someone, how could they afford to have a family entertainment outing, is beyond me. And so when we relate that back to the education system, we have to educate our white counterparts and let them know, hey, we have working class parents. Every parent is not a single mom or a single dad. There are married couples in our school. This child may be hyperactive. That doesn't mean they live with grandma or they're in a foster care. You know, we have to allow that cultural relevant pedagogy play out in all of the different grade bands, as well as within the educational system. And so I think with relationship and what you all are doing right here lends to that conversation, so we can dispel these stereotypes.
I think it's really critical. I want to jump back to what Raquel said as far as racism being systematic and it being a web of practices and beliefs. And when you pull it off the individual, it makes for a more conscious conversation that needs to be had. And even further, when Charmaine talked about there's a significant difference between implicit bias and being a racist. I think sometimes that racist term is thrown out immediately on a person, and you may not even know what you're saying about that person. They may just be bringing their implicit bias to the table, and it plays out in a way that we don't expect. But I want to speak to specifically on that education part. I think one thing that has to be brought to the table is one way we can combat it is by making our parents more aware of the things that are actually happening in the school building in respect to their children. I shudder to think about the times that I've had to have conversations with parents when their child is about to be put on an IEP and they were unaware of even the process that got their child to that place, why the child was deemed in that way. And they're just looking at the papers and saying, well, I guess we have to do this. It's a lack of awareness. And even further, when the child may have been guilty of something, of going against the policies in the school, and the response was an immediate suspension, well, there needs to be further discussion with our parents to understand that you can advocate on behalf of your child, that it does not have to end this way. But I believe sometimes the system takes advantage of the uninformed. The system is built and propagated and advanced because we're uninformed. And so I think one part that we can combat it is making our parents more aware of how the system works in the building, so they can be more of an advocate and speak on behalf of the child.
I think building on that, Mark, is even taking a step further and encouraging them or educating them on how they can actually challenge that system. The system doesn't have to stay status quo, right? These parents can show up to board meetings. They can show up to certain things. They can even work to elect different board members for their school boards, right? Like there's different ways that they can advocate for change, because there are practices in place regarding disproportionate discipline that is essentially systemically racist, right? Beyond just how we view kids in general, Black boys older than how they are, the criminality of Black girls and push out, all those different things that are coming to light right now. But even once they're at that point, I think we have, I can't tell you how many situations I've been in when I was assistant principal where I'm sitting at an expulsion table for a kid that I know that's the worst thing that possibly could happen to this child, but I had no other option, right? Because of the way that policies and practices were set up, and encouraging folks on the outside, community members, in addition to parents, to really challenge those policies and practices. Take a look at them. I don't know how many people in the community actually look at the board policies of their district, right? That they're paying taxes for. But there's definitely a way to really even advocate.
And I fully agree. And it's going back to that awareness. I mean, a lot of time is spent on national politics, but listen, the real impact is right there locally. What is happening on your school board level, your city council level, your community. That's the reality of our lives, is responding on the local level. And when we don't begin to build on that thing and we focus nationally, we miss out on what's actually happening or impacting our community. So I totally agree with what Raquel said. You have to be aware, you have to challenge the system for it to change, because it does not have to stay status quo. But if we continue to be silent, it will continue as it is.
You know, I'm just loving being part of this conversation. And I think one of the things I'm maybe most excited about is really why we exist as Ohio Gap Closers, because you all are mentioning relationships within the school, relationships between the administrators, you know, and the community, the parents and the community, the parents and the school, voting in local people. And I think one of the things that I heard my brother Travis talk about really is the need for more mental health care and advocacy within the school, because it's hard to educate a parent who they themselves likely, you know, they could have something else going on. They could be overwhelmed with something else. And Travis, I'm gonna let you give the example that you gave yesterday about the amount of training a social worker receives versus a school resource officer, because in the school, what we need is more support for students and parents. We have teachers. I'm married to a teacher, and I imagine, and I listen to what he says about managing in the classroom, and then managing the parents after school, you know, managing their emails, managing their phone calls, trying to get them the education, but also still managing the classroom. So I don't know, Travis, if you want to talk about that example of the need for more of that within the school.
I think what Emily was referring to, and I was speaking on the other day, was in school settings, teachers are trained to teach. Their primary focus is to teach the classroom and educate our children. A social worker, even a generalist social worker, the bachelor level social worker, we're trained in de-escalation techniques. We're trained in how to mediate situations. We're trained in just, you know, dealing with people. So when a teacher has a behavior issue, their skill set, while they may have the skills to address that, the social worker has more of a skill set to be able to pull tools off their tool belt to handle that situation. So a lot of the issues can be solved or can be helped by adding more social workers in the system, in the school system, in the police system, in the community in general. Utilizing our social workers can really help the community in a lot of ways. It starts with, though, kind of getting rid of the stigma of reaching out to social workers. A lot of people, especially in the Black community, don't like to look at the social work community for help because they've had this thought of, oh, children's services and taking away our kids. But that's not all that we do. The majority of the things we do is addressing psychosocial needs. Those are the things that keep us from handling the things that we need to. Those are the things that are like addressing the lower level Maslow's hierarchy of food, water, sleep, you know, and just a need for security. If you don't have those things addressed, you're not worried about education. You're not worried about going to the doctor. You're not worried about those higher level things if you can't take care of those lower level things. So social workers can be implemented in the school system to address some of those needs with the children and with the families.
Travis, I think you made a great point there. We saw this in the education system when we shifted from the school to online learning. So the virtual learning academies, you could see where you had maybe 30 to 40 students, 30 to 40% of your student base at each school involved with the virtual learning academy. and the other 60 to 70% weren't involved. And as educators, we had to think, why are they not, engaged in their learning at this time? And one of the reasons is that bottom tier of Maslow's hierarchy. Parents, may have lost their job. They're trying to find food. They're trying to ensure that their bills are paid. They're trying to make sure they have a roof over their head. And also, although we gave out Chromebooks, does everyone have access to Wi-Fi? And those type of issues there play out. But Travis, we also need to speak to the bigger picture. Where is the communication between school districts and these outside organizations that can provide the support to the schools? As an administrator, we reach out to the organizations that are in our forefront, who have partnerships with our districts at hand, unless we go outside and word of mouth, someone says, well, this organization per se can help you with this, or this organization can bring a food bank to your school every Saturday, or this organization can provide clothing. But if that administrator is not connected, how can we do those wraparound services for our children? Because at the end of the day, they are the ones that suffer at the hands of the lack of communication from adults. And we talk about racism. We saw it when COVID-19 hit. We saw it. We saw the disparities in the communities. We saw the disparities with children logging on. We saw the disparities of children getting food. And we saw the disparities when parents lost their jobs. And so we need to talk about what is happening in the inner city. What is happening with educating our parents? Why are we not having conversations about what is family involvement versus family engagement? As an administrator, I should be working towards engagement with my parents. There should be an open door policy. My parents should be comfortable calling me. My parents should be comfortable coming into the school. My parents should be comfortable sitting in the classroom and becoming educated along with their child so they can better support at home. And if that's not taking place and all we're worried about is involvement, am I coming to open house or am I coming to parent-teacher conferences so we can have numbers? We're doing the wrong thing as educators. We're tying our parents' hand, but steady pointing a finger at them. And that's not right. We need to have a true partnership, bridging the gap between home and school and making sure those supports are put in place from the educators. We were trained to do this. This is what we went to school to do. And if we're not going above and beyond, you're not being a good steward over what was placed in your hand as an educator. And so we need to open our eyes and make sure we are providing all the wraparound supports that are necessary for our children. I don't care if they're on Whittier Avenue. I don't care if they're in the bottoms on the west side or in the poorest areas of Cleveland or Cincinnati. We need to make sure all of our children receive the necessary education. It's a law. Free, appropriate public education. It's a requirement. It's a requirement. And I'll get off my soapbox.
Hey, I want to jump in because Charmaine, you bringing fire right now, and so I want to try to give a quick tool for parents, and maybe Ms. Jen Stovall, you can maybe back me up a little bit on this. I think almost every school is going to have at least one staff member or at least one teacher that has a child of their own flesh and blood, that has come through those doors and through those hallways and to those classrooms. And so earlier, I think Raquel and Mark mentioned, and you even mentioned, Charmaine, IEPs, gifted. We mentioned AP classes, access to the high-level rigorous coursework. I would say, without doubt, if that school has a staff member with a son or daughter in that school, I can guarantee they'll be in the classes with the most hardworking teachers, the ones that have an abundance of love, the ones that do everything they can to make sure their students are successful. And so if I'm a parent and I want to know where to begin, you need to go to your school administrator, look at that schedule, bell 1, bell 2, bell 3, bell 4. Okay, is that the class you'd put your son in? Is that the class you put your daughter in? And you don't always have that option. If you're in a small school, in a large school, you have more options. But I think you should just be aware as a parent or as somebody that's listening tonight, you can go talk to your school admin or your school counselors about scheduling and why am I in this class versus that class? Why do I have Mrs. X instead of Mrs. Z? So I think there's just value in having that power to know when you get that school schedule, it's not set in cement. It can be amended. And you should talk to your school administrators and counselors about scheduling those classes that are going to be best suited for your children.
And as a school counselor, I know I invite, I only have a group of 400, but I invite parents, come talk to me once a year. I mean, they can come more, but every year we should be meeting at least once to have a sit down and look at the year. What classes are you wanting your child in? What support services? It's just trying to invite and get them in and make them feel comfortable. That's not happening everywhere. And I'm not just saying at Westerville, I'm just saying across the nation, people aren't inviting. So how do we get this word out to parents and saying, we want you to come in? We've talked before about going out into the community, going to churches, going to places that maybe parents have trouble with transportation and meeting them where they are. I think that's something we also need to look at because not everybody can always come to us. So I agree with you, Taylor, when we do need to, there are many people that get their kids into classes if they know the right people or they know the right questions to ask. And unfortunately, if you're not in education, you don't know. So it is our job to educate for sure.
I think
so if anybody else has, if you have any ideas, you can throw my way. I'll throw on out. That would be great.
I think it's definitely important to meet the clients and their families where they are. I work for a mental health and mental and behavioral health organization. And a lot of our children we had less engagement from the children, less of them involved in their schoolwork once we had COVID. And people made all these assumptions as to why they weren't involved. And one of the biggest things were most of their parents were the frontline workers that were at work and didn't have the time or ability to be at home and to engage with the therapist or the teachers or whatnot. So I think it's really important to meet the students as well as the parents where they are. If you have to schedule a late appointment to connect with that parent, then schedule that late appointment. Sometimes we have to, be more flexible to provide the services to our clients that we needed to provide. So I think it's very important, even with food and other resources. Our agency had to take food to the children's home and to our clients and things like that. It's just important, in my opinion, for mental health and for education and everything to meet the parents and the students where they are.
I think also, we spent a little bit of time talking about Maslow's needs and some of those very concrete needs, but also in our last call, Kimberly Braswell brought up epigenetic trauma and how you have these passed down traumas from racism or other things and experiences that have been sort of medically actually sort of verified that it's passed down through your DNA, right? Where children who might not necessarily be on the verge of hunger or other things, but they're still really suffering from some mental health issues that we don't address sometimes in schools because we think they're okay, right? We think they're the students who are doing well. They're the students who are in positions of success or quote unquote have two parents in their home or whatever other sort of barometers that we're using for success, and really thinking about what trauma looks like in our schools on a spectrum and how we're actually meeting those needs. I appreciate what Travis was saying, definitely more social workers. Almost every school that I've worked in has had some sort of security or whatever, but I've been in schools that do not have social workers, right? And I think that disparity is alarming.
Yeah, I think that one of the initiatives that's happening across the state of Ohio that I hope continues is the focus on trauma-informed care for kids at the community level, also at the individual level in the schools, but recognizing that trauma-informed care, where we account for the impact of adverse childhood experiences on how that child is functioning, and moving away from that perspective when we look at behaviors at school that tend to come to everybody's attention. But instead of asking what's wrong with this kid, what's happening with this kid, what has happened, what challenges is this child up against? Trauma-informed care, if that can continue to sweep through Ohio, I think that the educational experience is going to be enriched. And I totally agree with social workers at school, so that teachers can teach and social workers can do all of the things that Travis described, that I think social workers do have a niche, and counselors in the school districts. And, I think that the issue, I saw Taylor kind of do this, and I know that funding continues to be the issue, and funding to assure that this care can happen. And not just when we label a kid with a diagnosis in order to get access to funding. I worry about that. And currently that's sort of the setup, is you have to get a label in order to get the services. And so more preventative dollars. And that is all about who we elect and who we support, so that prevention is more of a focus than after the fact.
Treatment.
Yeah, I'd love to just say, you talked about who we elect, and I really sometimes am just sick to death when we get into that political world about elected officials, because, from a national level, sometimes you just feel like, how the heck did we get here? And even from a local level, you feel like, how the heck did we get here? But Mark touched on it earlier, it's about that local energy. And across the TV, you get all the press about the national news and national elections, but you really make good progress when you and your community show up at the polls locally. Even something I was thinking about when I talk about the national political landscape is politically correct and morally correct are not always the same thing, right? And so you'll see things from a political lens, and things get into our school systems because someone's at a state house instead of on the ground in the trenches, and things come about and it can go into law, but that doesn't always mean it's right. And so you've got to be engaged. You got to respond locally. That's just my take on maybe some of that political action that parents and community can take.
I think from the social work lens, we talk about micro and macro level practicing. When we talk about micro, that's the day-to-day activities that you guys are all addressing. That's dealing with the counseling, the in the school behaviors, and the things that affect you daily. But we also need a team of people addressing the macro level, the laws and legislation that is put in place that has a trickle-down effect in what's happening in our community. So we got to address both levels, and social work, that's just the lens we look through when we call it micro and macro.
I do think we need to really think through what we say we need in our communities. And what I mean by that is, there's a reason why we have such a policing presence in our schools as it is today, right? Like, that comes from somewhere. There's this belief that you have higher crime rates. You have these certain places are more dangerous than others. Certain places have more dangerous behavior. And that is rooted in some very systemically racist beliefs. And so when we're talking about kind of tackling racism from a political perspective, I think it's challenging those notions, right? Because statistically, Black people do not commit more crimes than white people as a rate, right? But yet we police Black communities and Black schools. We do these things in response and say that's what we need. And so I think that even thinking about the funding question, right? There's funds that are allocated towards security that can be repurposed, right? To support mental health services, like that's already existing. And then when we're thinking from a larger, who are voting for city council, county council, even from a state legislator perspective, the state legislator one is an interesting thing for me, because most state legislators that I know walk around and no one knows who they are, right? Like, we're not invested in state level politics, even though state level politics run our schools, right? The federal government does not run our schools. So these folks every day are fighting for issues in their community, and they represent that particular populace. And so we must hold them accountable when it comes to these conversations. I sit on several committees simply because most of my politician friends know nothing about education, nothing, right? But they have education committees, they have all this stuff, but they're looking for folks who can provide them with real information that they can use on the ground level. So those are my thoughts.
I'll say this very quickly. You talked about the elected officials and they just being common people that most people will not recognize. And on the other hand, they sit in such powerful positions that make decisions that impact us for years. Even in one way that, and it takes a lot, but it's worth investigating. When they have these hearings about issues that involve your city or your local government, and you have to show up and actually speak to these elected officials, because they're listening to, they were elected by the people and they're listening to the thoughts of the people. But if we're not there to speak to it, and I know there's inhibitors everywhere that stop you from getting involved, and trust me, we all have busy lives, we have a lot of responsibilities. But at the end of the day, we have to get involved on some level on a political landscape in order to make real change, because that's how the system is set up now, and you cannot become that Trojan horse unless you're in the system on some level. I'm not saying for us to become desecrated by the system, but you have to get involved on some level to know what's going on and how to really impact the change. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Kind of a side note, but not really. But have any of you heard of the app or website Good Unite Us? I don't know if you've ever heard that, but it talks or it gives you information about where you're spending your money and which political platform it supports. So if you download this app and you type in where you go grocery shopping or gas station or what car you buy or banking, it'll tell you which political platform it supports. So that's just kind of having money go where maybe you know what side that you want to side with. So it's kind of so it's Good Unite Us.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think what we can do is we'll get together, excuse me, and share out maybe a PDF with all of the things that the community can tap into as far as immediate resources to be able to track those dollars, to know which organization is supporting what. And, you know, I'm just trying to be in the moment about how do we get here. And, you know, there's so much energy right now from so many communities and so many allies. And, you know, I'm really impressed, quite honestly, for a moment. And then I become a little bit worried about what makes this energy in 2020, whether it's sustainable or what makes it any different than different movements we've seen in previous years and previous generations. And so looking at what's going on in 2020, I think on the front end of it, it's really clear. Police brutality, people are losing their lives. Black men, Black women, whether we're talking Louisville, Kentucky and Breonna Taylor, or Minneapolis with George Floyd, and the countless others, we are losing human beings. We're losing fathers, we're losing mothers, we're losing sisters, we're losing brothers. And so that brings us to this moment. And I just have to be honest. I think throughout the American history that most of us are taught in school, the evidence tells me that this too shall pass. And we could be back in similar scenarios. For example, in the past 2 weeks, we have Black men being hung by trees. We're in a really bad place. And so what is it that I can look to? And this is just me talking right now. There's 2 things that help me sleep at night. 3, I'll start with God, but after God, the youth or the students, the young people, in technology. And Jen Stovall, you just mentioned an app. We wouldn't even see the horrific scenes that we're seeing if it wasn't for technology. And so I really think that the fact that we have young people that are talented, energetic, and they have a moral compass, we can look to our young people as reason to be optimistic. And then I would also say we can look to technology as a potential ally. And so I'll stop talking at that, but I just think that the evidence of some of the protests, the evidence of the horrific nature of police brutality, the evidence says we'll do this all over again soon. But I've got to just hold true to young people and technology. I'm going to put my eggs in that basket.
I agree with you, Taylor. And there's actually a scripture that really reminds me of this. It's found in John, and it's 1 John. It talks about how, God called the young because they were strong, and the older because they knew the way or assumed that they have more wisdom. And I agree that's one thing that is encouraging about right now. I do worry though, because even myself being in the millennial generation, there's not a lot when we want to do something, and even Gen Z behind me, there's a thought and you go and do it. And I do worry about that for their own safety during this time and just their endurance during this time. And I think about so many of those that came before us and the endurance that they had. But that does encourage me, knowing that the young people right now, they're the ones that are going to keep it going.
I see what's going on right now reminds me of the Birmingham Children's March. And the Birmingham Children's March were led by children, ages 4 to college. And so if it had not been for them organizing and getting things together with some of the local leaders, we would not have had the civil rights movement. It was because of the children that we are where we are today in our society. And I don't think as educators, we let our children know how powerful they are and the voice they have in our society. They can go before legislation. They can read legislation. They can write letters to legislators. They have that type of power. They can do that as young as elementary. As classroom teachers, you can take a field trip to the State House and you can meet with legislators. You can, as an administrator, you can meet with your state representative and have them come to the school and question them. What are your values? What do you think about education and the state of education at this moment? And I think with our children, they need to understand the power that they actually have, their voice. And they need to learn how to turn their anger and resentment into resilience, and learn how they can change that anger to help others, to become a little bit more structured and organized, and looking to big business and seeking their support. I mean, look at what Nike is doing at this time, reaching out to those different organizations and going towards those who have wisdom, as opposed to just using violence and anger and getting into a battle. Because if we look at the history of the Fraternal Order of Police, this is what they've always done. This is their history. This is their foundation. They watched out for the slave. They watched out for those Blacks in those areas who were doing wrong. This has always taken place since the inception of the United States of America. This is what police have always done, and this is what they continue to do. You know why? Because they're given the power to do so. And until we learn how to educate our children on the constructs that are put in place, I think we're going to always come back to this same old scenario over and over again. I could not be a mother of a young male at this time. I think it's very scary, the situation we're in right now. Imagine having a teenage son who works a job and thinking about him driving home at night, or him going out to the movies or to a restaurant, those things that we enjoyed as high schoolers. I couldn't imagine my young son being out and enjoying a milkshake at Steak and Shake with his buddies and leaving out in a car and the police pulling them over. Because right now, this is what's happening in America. And it's not enough people having these conversations and having that empathy and putting themselves in other people's shoes and seeing how it's affecting the family unit, not only the community, but let's draw it closer. Those mothers who are crying at night on their knees praying and wanting these issues and this violence to stop. Let's get beyond the protest. Let's just think about, can I be a normal child? Can I just grow up? And I was having a conversation about this whole wearing masks to school. Think about a young male wearing a scarf over his face, walking to school when school comes back in. I'm a young Black male and I'm walking down the street with a blue, red, white, black bandana across my face because I'm trying to social distance and follow what has been told to me by my governor and the school system. But now I'm being pinpointed and targeted because I have a mask on my face. Or is this another avenue that the police can use to target our young Black men? We're not talking about that. This I can see this coming into fruition when the school year start back up. You got a group of young Black males walking to school with their mask on, trying to be safe so they don't get sick. And now this is used as another target. We have to think about that. How can we support our young Black children, male and females? How can we put services in place to support them?
I'd just like to piggyback on a piece of that. We keep talking about the youth and the things that they're doing. I like to just, in the community, in the realm I work in is with the youth, with foster care youth. People ask, what can they do? And we've named a lot of things already. If you're looking from a spiritual aspect, you look at what's your gifts, or a social work aspect, what's your strengths. So use the things that you are good at. Use the things that God gave you the talent to do. So we talked about the social media aspect. Create FaceTime chats with your friends and have conversations. One person can affect another person, and that person can affect a community can affect the world. So it just keeps spreading. It starts with relationships. So start in your circle. Do the things that you're good at. If you're an artist, downtown, you look at all the murals and the posters and the things that you see down there, and that's changing some destruction into art. You make posters, make street signs. If you can't hang them in downtown, put them in your house, put them in your window, just so people can see some of the things that you're good at. Put them online. Other things you can do is just use your musical talents. I see spoken word poems and things in places. So just try to use the skills that you got to create change and affect what's going on. That's how youth can get off, especially foster care youth. You can't always, as a foster care kid, say, Mom or Dad, I'm going down to the protest. You have to find other ways to get involved. And those other ways to get involved is vast, emailing senators and your legislators, committees, and trying to find out who's in charge and what we can do, forming subgroups and sending letters to people, and just uplifting people in your own neighborhood. So trying to find some of those action steps kids can already get involved in that's available to them now.
I think, like you said, Charmaine, about our young having a voice and having so much power. If you look at the Montgomery boycott, we were able to create change based upon our refusal to support the Montgomery bus company by not riding. And we have the same power today. We can refuse to support businesses and organizations that refuse to stand up to racism and other things. So I think the one thing why social justice is different in 2020, because our younger people have the ability to impact the pockets of these larger companies and organizations. So I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing a difference now.
I think that's a perfect example. And I think, Raquel, you had your hand up, if I'm not mistaken, but just a few days ago, our president was basically overtaken by Gen Z, and young people having the ability to hop on TikTok, buy 20,000 tickets just to not show up and send a message. And so that's not stopping people from dying, but it's just a sign of young people and technology. And I will, one more time, I'm gonna hold on to that. Raquel, did you have your hand up?
Sorry.
I was just cheering on the responses. That was my reaction hand.
So let's, if you guys, are you guys comfortable? Can we do a round robin? Can we all maybe just close out this conversation with maybe one solution that's near and dear to your heart when you talk about social justice, when you think about racism, and when you think about, okay, maybe I can't do everything, but I can do something. Can we just go around the horn and maybe all give one recommendation to a parent, recommendation to a teacher, recommendation to a social worker, or whatever lens you want to put on it? And I'll start with whoever wants to start first. I'll leave it up to you guys.
I'll jump in, Taylor, if that's all right. I think the one thing that each adult can do is find a child to speak into, invest into, to help make the difference that we're looking for. Just find one. If you're blessed to have your own children, wonderful. But if you don't have your own, find a child that you can invest in to help make the change that you're looking for.
I agree. I think one thing that needs to be done more is many of us on this line get to sit in some of those important meetings that happen at the higher decision-making level with those who are making the decisions. And I think we have to say something. You know, we have to see it and we have to say something. And I can, you know, think of all the times where before, as a younger professional, I would hear and I would experience things and not have the strength or courage to say anything in those boardrooms, but that has changed. And I think that has to continue. If I see something, I have to speak up.
I think, I'm sorry, you wanna go?
Go ahead, Raquel.
I think similar to Emmy, I think, you know, for me, it's speaking truth to power in whatever space, right? So that could be with my mother, that could be in a position of leadership, you know, wherever. I think when you have knowledge, it's an imperative that you share that information, and using Mark's word, invest, right? Investing in your community is sharing that knowledge and encouraging that learning and that growth.
I'll go ahead and go next. So I've just noticed being white, my white friends, family, just people that I know, majority want to have a role in fighting, but they don't know what to do. So educating myself, continuing to educate others. And we've been having small groups, and we break those small groups out into other, kind of like Travis had said, just kind of keep communicating, educating, and being willing to listen. I think that's huge. So that's my goal over the next 20 years.
I think it's important to for us to start advocating to have people at the table who look like us that are affected by racism and other issues as far as police brutality, disparities in education, healthcare, housing, everything else. I think we need to start advocating to have more of those people that are affected at the table in the decision-making process. I also think it is really important as well as to be open to having those conversations. Sometimes I think you can make a change if you bring along people who are unaffected by racism or lack of access to care and, you know, disparities in education. I think once we get people who are unaffected by these things on board, we'll have more change. I think that's one of the most important things, bringing those people that are unaffected on board and having them fight for the same cause.
I'll jump in. I think as educators and as leaders, we need to train our children on how to critically think about the issues at hand and have them research on their history, American history, and have them related to what's taking place today so that they can make sound decisions and have sound judgment when it comes to combating some of the social and political issues that we see today. And I think it starts at home and moves into the education system.
Thank you. I'll jump in here before you go, Travis. And something that I think we've got to do as parents and as people in the community is get into the economic mind frame and just being practical. Get life insurance, get supplemental life insurance, because if we're here because of Black people dying, I just think that that's something that we're missing. So let's really be practical when it comes to financial literacy. Every single person that's listening better have life insurance, because you never know what time is your last time. So you need to be smart and take care of your loved ones. And so economic, financial literacy, life insurance, supplemental life insurance. And then I think there's something around entrepreneurship that we got to tap into. We have to be able to enjoy our lives, and it is okay to be a consumer, but it's not okay to just be a consumer. So we got to figure out that magic lane to get more entrepreneurial spirit in our community so we can be self-sustaining. So I think that's my feedback. And I think between Tracy and Travis, I'll give it to you guys.
Thanks, Taylor. I think that my call would be for social workers. Two of the core values of the profession of social work is to practice with competency and to value social justice, and that we social workers ought to be leaders in micro, meso, and macro movements. And so definitely want to continue the organization efforts that this should continue to be a value of all the young social workers and the social workers that are close to retirement. We should all be passionate. And our social service agencies, our nonprofits, need to do more than put that they value diversity in their policy and procedure manuals. They need to practice it, and we need to be immersed in that value. And so moving forward, that's what I would like to see.
Thank you, Tracy. I will just sum it up with our Ohio Gap Closers pillars, 3 pillars that we were founded on: overcoming, giving, and contributing. If I look at overcoming, and it's a plea to society in general, overcoming barriers, overcoming those obstacles that's in front of us, overcoming fears to speak out in tough situations. Those things we have to do as a collective, as a society. We got to be able to overcome. And then 2, giving our time. God gave us 2 ears to listen twice as much as we talk. So we want to be able to listen, to understand, not to just respond. So we got to do those things consistently as listening. And it's a whole process of active listening. That's a whole nother training I'll get into later. But and the last thing is contribute. I think Mark that hit on contributing, and some of that can look like mentorship. What can you do to contribute to someone in society, in this community? Contribute your time, your skills, your effort to improving or helping someone else. So those things, that's what this company was founded on, OGC, Ohio Gap Closers, overcoming, giving, and contributing. And I think that's what I want to impart on this session today.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Travis, way to bring it home. Good job. For everybody that's watching, we really appreciate you tuning in and supporting. But understand, this is not a period. This is a comma. The story continues. And so we do have different workshops and trainings that we would love to bring to you and your organization. If it's appropriate, those workshops include mental health. And really, what brought us to the table tonight is cultural humility and that cultural competency that a lot of us as individuals and organizations are lacking. We do work with getting your son or daughter to college, academic achievement, alternatives to school suspensions. And so check out our website, ohiogapclosers.com. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a good night, everybody.